All right, good morning, everybody. On behalf of ForeSpace, welcome to this morning's event, The Future of Biodiversity in a Changing Planet, whereby you'll hear from two researchers who will be introduced shortly. This event is, of course, part of a week-long series of events on sustainability and the climate crisis, brought to you by the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center in collaboration with ForeSpace. What is ForeSpace, you might wonder if you're not familiar with us. We are a university space located in downtown Jojage on unceded indigenous land. And as a physical space, we operate as the front door to the university. So essentially a place where you can come in and experience any number of interactive live events daily. And while you're there, you might take the opportunity to learn about what Concordians are working on in terms of research, various initiatives, and course activities. So we invite you to check out our schedule of events by going to our website, concordia.ca/4, the number 4. Those of you wanting to share this talk with your friends and colleagues, you're in luck. We are currently recording and live streaming at CU ForeSpace on Facebook, so I'll pop in those links in the chat in a moment. You're more than welcome to join in the conversation today by sharing any thoughts in the chat throughout. And we urge you to use the panelist and attendees option from the pull down menu as you do so, just so we all can see your comments. However, if you have questions for the question period after both speakers have presented a little, we'll open it up for questions. And at that point, we'll invite you to pop your questions into the Q&A box here in the webinar, making our moderator's life a little easier so he can track where the questions are coming in. Or if you prefer to speak, just raise your virtual hand and we'll sweep in and unmute you and invite you into the conversation that way. Okay, it's now my pleasure to pass proceedings over to Jim Grant. Over to you, Jim.
Great, thank you, Anna, and to ForeSpace for co-hosting our 4th annual Sustainability Cross Disciplines Conference, along with the Loyola College for Diversity and Sustainability and the Loyola Sustainability Research Center. I also want to acknowledge that Concordia University is located on unceded indigenous land, and Montreal is traditionally known as Jojage. Well, welcome to our first event on this 3rd day of our 5-day discussion on climate change, the climate crisis, and sustainability. We've got a really exciting event to bring you right now called The Future of Biodiversity in a Changing Planet. I'll introduce our two panelists. First up will be Dr. Pedro Perez Nito, professor and Canada Research Chair in the Department of Biology. He's also a member of the LSRC. His research involves large-scale field studies and experimental, quantitative, and theoretical approaches to study one of the central questions in ecology: why are species where they are? And our second speaker is Dr. Lilian Salez. She's a postdoctoral researcher working in the Perez Nito lab in the Department of Biology. She uses mathematical models to understand the drivers of species distribution at landscape, regional, and global scales. Currently, her main research goal is to understand the redistribution of biodiversity in the Anthropocene. So thank you very much, panelists, and take it away, Pedro.
Thanks, Jim. I'm just gonna start by sharing my screen. All right, good morning, everyone. So this is an exciting topic. I mean, we could spend an entire week talking about how's the planet gonna look like in terms of biodiversity and the services that biodiversity provide to us. And this could be really exciting. I want to talk to you today, how do we think about predicting what this future possibly could be? There could be many futures. Often we refer them to scenarios, as we're going to see. I'm not going to get too technical. There's a lot of there could be a lot of statistical and mathematical ways to present this problem, but I want to keep this to as a broad to a large audience as possible, and hopefully this is going to be enjoyable for everyone. So, how to predict the future of biodiversity in a changing planet? So one of the things that we need to understand first is that species distributions, right, single species distributions, or number of a species in any place on the planet, and even ecosystem types, they often are predictable by climate. So that's the first thing that we need to understand to make predictions of how climate will change to then affect, is to understand that in fact, many animals, plants, it's a general rule that species are not everywhere, and often their distribution is actually restricted or constrained by climate features and other environmental features for which those species, through adaptation and other processes such as abiotic interactions, competition, predation, and so forth, they're restricted to. So those are a few examples. This is a famous studies in mountains, for instance, by Whitaker in the 50s, that sees that the abundance of different species, they change as some prefer dry environments, some prefer more wet environments or humid environments. This is another famous plot, which basically using temperature and precipitation here, and sort of drawing the types of forests that we can find according to the values of precipitation and temperature. So climate has many facets, right? There's many variables that can describe climate. Precipitation and temperature is just two of them, but there's many, many, many. And there's ways in which climate can change. Climate could change in average. That's one of the things that we think. The average temperature is going to increase and so on. But other ways of changing is variance. There will be lots of changes. Some places will vary more throughout space and time in their variances. And for instance, there's the mammal richness number of species today, according to plots of 50 by 50 kilometers on the planet. As you can see, the tropical areas, it's very well known that it tends to have more species, more energy. Tropics are also older in terms of time because they didn't have as much glaciation. There's more energy, there's more productivity, and so forth. So there's many ways in which biodiversity is driven by climate. But this is important to know because we want to model the future of biodiversity according to climate. So we need to first have the sense that biodiversity changes, actually varies in time, in space, and will vary in time according to the variation in those climate features. Another thing that has been, but not enough discussed, is the fact that mountain ranges are also, in ways, they observe changes in climate, right? It tends to be much hotter at the bottom of a mountain than at the top. And there's many ways in which actually biogeography, which is the science of the study of distribution species, one of the fathers or the father of biogeography, Alexander von Humboldt, described actually typical variation in plants in the mountain Mount Chimborazo in 1805, already identifying that different types of plants and communities of plants, they are associated to different heights, right? And mountains are very important. In mountain ranges, they're home of 80% of the world's vertebrate species and 1/3 of the global species diversity. And so even though mountains landscapes cover only about 25% of the planet, is a lot, they encompass 50% of biodiversity, and we haven't discussed them enough. I'm not going to discuss them much today, but I think it's important to make the point that mountains will also have a lot of changes. What's happening in space, that space climate's getting warmer, this is also changing the way mountains going to look like in the future. So the same way that climate is becoming warmer in space like this is going to become also pushing hotter temperatures as you go towards the top. So this would be the distribution, say, of today, and there will be a huge change of those layers of climates and vegetation and ecosystem types in mountains that we'll see. Some will even disappear in the future. So as we know, climate is changing as the effect of many factors. We often think about CO2 because CO2 is one of the, it's the most important gas producing changes in global temperature. And as we know, they're going to have huge effects in terms of changing the way climate's going to be distributed and the way species are going to distribute themselves. And we're going to have lots of changes also in patterns that are related to temperature, but a lot in terms of precipitation as well. We're going to have changes from wet to dry and dry to wet, and a lot of variance. That's another thing that is very important. And that brings lots of challenges to, one thing is to change in the way average is changing, which is well behaved. But when you start thinking that there's a lot of oscillations through time, this brings other challenges, right? So, but one of the things that we need to also realize, I'm not saying it's a good thing, I'm just saying it's something that is needed to be realized, is that we're going to have losers and winners in terms of species. Some species actually they're going to move north. For instance, we're going to have lots of new species coming from the US and elsewhere moving to Quebec. Some could have economic interests, but we're going to lose lots of species. So the losers and winners, when we speak here, is about ecosystems and space. Some places going to win in terms of going to gain species, and some will. And the overall consensus that lots of species will disappear, unfortunately, through time. So what is biodiversity? That's a really, really big question. A lot of people have the sense that species are part of biodiversity. Number of species is biodiversity. We call this richness. But there are other facets of biodiversity that are quite important. For instance, genetic diversity. One is going to be tricky to model in the future. So we know that genetic diversity, even within species within space, can vary quite a lot. Some parts of the planet has really high genetic diversity, and some parts of the planet have low genetic diversity, despite of the number of species that they have there. This is another example here, which is interesting. Earlier on, I showed to you that the number of species in the tropics are very high. But when you think about evolutionary diversity, there's some evidence. This is from mammals. There's some evidence actually that the amount of evolutionary diversity, that how much variation we find in evolutionary time across species occurred more, for instance, in Africa than in South America. So what is the kind of biodiversities we want to sort of predict is one question. The other is the kinds of biodiversity we want to save. That's another question. And which of those are more or less related to the services that we as societies we use from ecosystems. So all of those can be related to different types of services: number of species, evolutionary diversity as well, it's well known, and genetic diversity. So climate change will affect biodiversity, which will affect then their terrestrial and aquatic and marine ecosystems, which are important to provide ecosystem services to us and to our human being. And this is very well known. The biggest question here is how much capacity we have to adapt to those changes, and what are the strategies. And models come in this idea of developing strategies today to deal with the changes of the future. Well, again, there are climate change in itself is interacting with other factors, right? There is another big factor is land use and nutrient cycling that is changing. Some is changing as an effect of climate change itself, but some are changing just because we're modifying landscapes through changing land distribution, urbanization, and so on. And so we're affecting, increasing, for instance, certain natural occurring phenomena, such as fire, and so on. And those factors interact. So we have land use, we have climate, they interact in very complex ways. And how are we going to predict their interactions to climate change? There's some feeling that, that the next 30 years, 20 years, the huge effects will be really continuing changes of our landscapes through land use and urbanization and other types of physical direct interference. But in 20 to 30 years, then climate change will really have major effects that will be observable. And so there's, and so those interactions are not very easy and clear to how to model them. Lots of challenges. So species can basically, as a result of climate change, they can, unfortunately, they can go extinct. But often what happens in some cases, they will shift their distributions. For instance, they could be in the south and they can start moving north to track warmer climates as the north gets warmer. They could also expand. They could keep a lot of their spatial preferences in terms of climate, and they could expand, or they could contract their distributions. So extinction, contraction, shifts, and expansions, all those effects will be majorly important to actually understand how biodiversity will itself redistribute in the future. And this is just sort of a cartoon demonstrating this. As you're going to see, this is today, and in the future, some species, for instance, the green species, no longer here. Actually, it went extinct. Some species, they increased their spatial spatial distribution, and some restricted. So when you think about all this expansion, shifts, contractions, and extinction, how are we going to put all this together, considering, particularly when we consider thousands to 10,000s and hundreds of thousands of species? All right. One of the important things in what we call the field of global change biology is that change is a process, is not a combination of events. And this is very important to think that change is gradual, and it has happening, and it continues to happen. And sometimes we have a hard time seeing those things happening, but at one point, in 20, 30 years, 50 years, it's going to be very clear, those changes. Global change biology needs to incorporate conceptual science and not only quantification of trends and changes in space of time. And what I refer here, there's a lot of discussions within environmental science, global change biology, and ecology, is how to actually build those models. And global change, whether those models should or not incorporate certain knowledge or not, there's knowledge that is very complex to estimate. For instance, population growth and ability to reproduce and so on. And so there's so many parameters you could consider in a model that becomes complex. And it takes so long to actually estimate these things for lots of species that perhaps we not have enough time to predict the future in the time we need today to actually take action. So global changes in climate and other anthropogenic pressures have effects not only at global, but locally. We can see species changing very locally. So we have all kinds of information today, right? And we're going to talk a little bit about scenarios, but the idea here is that we try to understand what's going to be the climate in the future. There are many possibilities, right? And then we use this to model the future. So basically, we have those, what we call the species distribution model. Lilian's going to talk a little bit more about this later, but basically we have biodiversity information, climate information. Then we build models that predict the present. Then we put information that we think is going to happen in the future according to scenarios. We don't know the future. So there's lots of climate scenarios based on demographics, economics, how much CO2 is going to be put in the atmosphere, and those generates all kinds of scenarios. There's hundreds of scenarios, and each of the scenarios generate differences in climate in the future, and then we use those climate in the futures to make future predictions. And so this cartoon represents this idea of one Earth today and many potential Earths in the future, because we don't have, there's uncertainty related to those scenarios. There's uncertainty within the scenario itself. As you can see, this is this scenario that has this little number here. They used to have names in the past, and then we run out of names. We start calling them a little more in terms of numbers. I'm not going to get into the technical details, but there could be lots of variance around one single scenario. So there's uncertainty related to scenarios, and there's uncertainty related to the modeling technique itself. So for instance, this is a typical good usage of these models. This is the past distributions of a number of species of trees in the US, and the projected changes according to climate is those. So many of those have economical importance. So if we can use scenarios to predict what's going to happen in the future, maybe even with uncertainty, which needs to be taken into account, we can make those predictions. There will be economic opportunities. Industry is looking at those models very closely. For instance, Champagne, which is in this region here in France, which is a huge economic income for France, they already know with climate change, there's a big possibility that the best climate for Champagne is going to be here, just north of London, which is interesting. French companies are now buying land there, just predicting that potentially Chardonnay, the grapes that are used mostly for Champagne, Chardonnay, that is going to go there. So it's an interesting, there are many applications for agriculture and economics. We need data. There's lots of data. We need data today on species distribution. We need data on climate today and the future, and so on. So, and we need compute capacity. So those are shared resources that we often have as biodiversity science to produce those models. And, you know, we can produce maps of different types of maps for climate. There are many ways to classify maps, classify climates. Climates can change in average temperature, can change in variance, and it can also change in frequency. We're going to have some types of climates that are going to reduce in terms of their frequency, and some others that will increase in their frequency. Some rare are going to become even rarer, some rare are going to become common, some common are going to become rarer, some common are going to become even more common. And those are aspects that we're starting to think how we're going to integrate this into the models, because they affect biodiversity. So we have data, we built models, and then we generate this idea of future landscapes. How this future landscape is going to look like, and then try to think about policy, risk analysis, planning, and decision-making according to those changes. So the development and delivery of species distribution models to inform decision-making is a huge discussion today. It's not very clear yet how there's many views, there's many ways, whether we're going to have local views. Likely that's what's going to happen. This is happening in Canada today. Many provincial governments have been developing those models to integrate in their own without having necessarily a national view on this. And there are many things that we can use those models: climate change, conservation, reserve planning, diseases, invasive species, opportunistic species, monitoring, fragmentation, road construction, fire dynamics. So these models can be integrated in so many ways, recreation as well, for instance, fisheries to Canadians. And so I want to finish with this. One of the biggest challenges we have today is to have a platform where we, for instance, climatologists, they share one single platform where they have all the climate information, all the models, and there's a lot of exchanges among climatologists and climate scientists. We currently lack this for biodiversity. We don't have a single integrated way to think about the development. So we're pushing for this. So for instance, those are current models for biodiversity. There's many here. Those are biological, ecological components. As you can see, they all miss a little bit. There's no single model that takes all this. And because there's a lot of knowledge that is necessary to integrate here. So the idea is that we come up with this new futuristic digital platform for projecting and protecting global biodiversity called One Model, where we put everything together in a platform that we share data and we share coding, we share modeling, and perhaps to create a platform that is more useful for future predictions, and also for what we're going to do with those future predictions. With that, I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro, for a really interesting and beautiful presentation. I like the graphics. There is, well, we're going to hold most of the questions till after Lilian speaks. I see there's a question in the Q&A. Pedro, can you distinguish between invasive species and opportunistic species and how they differently affect modeling?
Yeah, so that's a good, that's a very, very good question. And often in ways that we think about is the parameters that determine those. right? So the parameters of, for instance, of species that are invasive, they're often different from those species that are opportunistic. And this is a big challenge because we need knowledge, we need biological knowledge of some of those. And often those models that are more coarse models, some of the models I discussed today, they are really not good for that distinction. And there are many types of models that are good for opportunistic. They're not going to be good for invasive and vice versa. And so this is a really big discussion. If you're more interested, please send me an email. I can send some references regarding this and continue the discussion.
Great, thanks, Pedro. By the way, that question was from Dr. Peter Stutt, our colleague.
Oh, okay. Well, we're gonna have a drink on this, Eric, and then we can discuss that.
Anyway, so we'll go now to our next speaker, and then we'll take all questions after. Our next speaker is Dr. Lilian Salez, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Biology. Lilian, please take it away.
Hi there. My name is Lilian. Thank you a lot for the introduction. I'm a postdoc at Concordia University at the laboratory of Pedro Perez Neto. And today I'm going to talk to you about continuing on the topics that Pedro has already started on the future of biodiversity in a changing planet. We know that temperatures on the planet are rising almost everywhere, but at different rates. Close to the equator, where it's already hot, if it grows warmer, animals will soon have to migrate. If gnus, for example, can't find enough food to eat on the African savanna, they'll go in search of it. To survive, big cats will have to follow their prey. Some animals, such as the mountain goat, will initially move up to colder areas, but if temperatures continue to rise, even the peaks might get too hot, and then the species will die out. Many species of fish are already responding to warmer ocean temperatures, migrating to colder regions around the poles. Other species, however, will profit from rising temperatures. The malaria and yellow fever mosquitoes, for example, will spread out, bringing along their deadly diseases. Climate change could eventually drive species to evolve, giving rise to new adaptations. What is clear now is that changes in climate and habitats will have long-term consequences, and for human beings as well. So, therefore, we see that as a response to climate change, species might either adapt, move towards newly suitable habitats, or face extinction. My interest in my research is to analyze the redistribution of biodiversity. I often question myself, how has the environment affected species distribution from past mass events of extinction to future human-driven changes on temperatures and habitats around the globe? How has the environment affected species distributions? To understand this question, I use mathematical models that relate species' environmental tolerances to the environments that exist at a given location. If you follow this graph, for example, you have two predictors, predictor 1 and predictor 2. In this figure, the upper panel indicates a two-dimensional depiction of these ones. One is a kind of species niche. The red oval indicates all the conditions of predictors 1 and 2 that allow the survival of populations of these species. However, as you can see in this dashed oval, not every suitable condition exists in a given moment in geographical space. That duality between the fundamental niche and the geographical space allows us to map species' potential distribution in space. However, under climate change, we don't expect, at least not for most vertebrate species, that niches might evolve. What is going to change is the conditions that exist at a given moment in space. As a consequence, this hypothetical example here, the species will have no climate analogs and will eventually go extinct. One example of the expected redistribution of biodiversity and what are the changes that it might cause in communities worldwide is the expected savanization of South America faunas in the next century. In South America, forecast models anticipate warmer and drier climates, which will be magnified by deforestation and the creation of open habitats. Those open habitats are structurally similar to degraded savannas and will likely allow the expansion of some savanna animals, such as this giant anteater, for example. To test for faunal savanization of South America rainforests, we compare the outcome of climate change biodiversity models of savanna versus forest species. In this figure, blue colors indicate projected species richness increase, while red colors indicate richness reduction. Our results indicate that species that occupy savannas, the left and middle panels, might expand their ranges towards regions that are currently occupied by tropical forests, those empty green polygons here, driving an increase in species richness in those habitat use groups. Conversely, forest specialist species in the right panel are expected to lose a lot of their suitable ranges and to retract toward core forest zones, such as here in the Amazon. If you want to know more about this results, you can find it here in this paper that we published last year. But that conceptual model that I presented to you, it can be expanded to incorporate community level processes. So in this figure, considering each colored ellipsoid as the niche of a different species, you have here a guan, a toucan, and a thrush, and a palm. We have that ellipsoids overlap indicate environmental conditions where co-occurrence between pairs of species, in this case between this palm and some bird seed dispersers, where their co-occurrence is likely, or at least is possible, restricted by the conditions that exist at any given time. Following the same rationale, in this hypothetical, following the same rationale, the projection of each species niche in geographic space gives you the potential distribution of species and the potential co-occurrence patterns for these subset of species, considering the same Hutchinson's duality and individualistic species response to climate change. In the future, as the climate changes, following the same rationale, the species niche is not likely to change, but the displacement of the ellipsoid of the conditions that exist at a given moment will rearrange species distributions and the patterns of co-occurrence. As you can see, the toucan will expand its range, the thrush might expand its range too, the distribution of this hypothetical palm will move to south, but the guan will have no climate analog, so it will likely go extinct. So as a function of climate change, we might lose not only species distributions, but the biotic interactions that they take place. This has cascading effects on ecosystem services and ecosystem functions. Ecosystem services are nature's benefits towards humans. In this example, the collection of seeds of the Brazil nut trees in the Amazon depends on the interaction between bumblebee pollinators and agouti seed dispersers. So the distraction, the benefit that humans get from the Brazil nut tree depends on interactions with wild species. In this case, pollination by insects and seed dispersal by mammals. If we project species distribution in space, we can track where co-occurrence and biotic interaction potentially takes place. In this figure, pink color depicts the plant potential distribution, while dark red colors indicate regions that are suitable for both the plant and, in this case, one species of bee. Oh, sorry. Under scenarios of climate change, as Pedro was explaining to you, we can forecast changes on species distribution and their potential co-occurrence. All of this into the future. By doing so, we can translate changes on co-occurrence patterns into proxies of biotically mediated ecosystem functions. So isn't it nice? By anticipating changes on species distribution, we can project into the future how ecological functions and the systems, and the services that they deliver to humans might change. Well, at least I find it cool. Overall, our results, considering the Brazil nut tree, indicate a loss of pollinator richness and likely ecosystem function resilience under climate change. In these simulations that we fitted, the potential distribution of the species of the plant was likely to expand in the future. But because the interacting fauna is likely to be reduced once responses to climate change are mostly individualistic, the species might suffer, even when it's considered to expand, because of the loss of the biotic interactions that allow its persistence and resilience in the future. If you want to know more about these results, you can check in the paper that has just come out. Climate change drives spatial mismatch and threatens the biotic interactions of the Brazil nut. Finally, I want to give you an example of how the redistribution of biotic interactions under climate change will affect not only ecosystem functions, but also the evolution of interacting partners. In this figure, the orange bellied thrush, here at left, has a small body mass and small gape size. Because of this, it can only ingest seeds below a certain threshold of size. Yet the toucan has a much larger gape and can ingest from small to large seed sizes. As a consequence, and as you can see in this graph, the frequency of ingestion of fruit size of the thrush is much more narrower than that of the toucan. That means that some seed sizes may not be ingested and some seed sizes may not be ingested and dispersed in the absence of this little guy here. If this is important for plants, then plants might have a problem, because if you remove toucans from this system, all you will have is small seeds being dispersed. We anticipated changes on the frugivores of neotropical palm species, and what we observed is that climate change will lead to a spatially structured loss of large-bodied frugivores. In this figure, dark red colors indicate higher species richness of large-gaped frugivores. So that from the present into the future, where the overall richness of large frugivores is likely to be reduced. This will have consequences for the evolution of the plant that is dispersed by these species. The spatially structured loss of large-bodied frugivores will cascade into size-specific selection regimes towards a smaller seed size on these neotropical palm species here, the Euterpiadalis. In this figure, red colors indicate strong selection towards reduction of seed size, while blue colors indicate a less strong selection towards the reduction, but it's all reduction. So overall, our results indicate a reduction of the palm seed size across its range as a function of the forecasted extirpation of large-bodied frugivores. So my main message with these final slides is that climate change, redistribution of biodiversity will not affect only species themselves, but also the interactions that they take place and cascading effects on ecosystem functions, ecosystem services, and even on the evolution or the co-evolution of these species in the future. All the details, again, can be found in this paper that was just accepted. No, it was just published in Global Ecology and Biogeography. In conclusion, the future of biodiversity in a changing planet will ultimately depend on whether individual species adapt, move, or go extinct. The redistribution of biodiversity will form novel communities, but can potentially disrupt biotic interactions via spatial mismatch. But ultimately, those novel biotas might create new trait selection regimes on interacting partners, co-affecting their evolution worldwide. If you have any specific comments, I'll be happy to receive them in my email as well, and I'll respond to any questions. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Lilian, for that fantastic presentation. It was so beautifully illustrated that is very accessible. I have a number of really interesting questions in the Q&A. I wonder if, in order, Carly, Brian, and Jochen wouldn't mind raising your hands, and we'll unmute you, because it'll be kind of fun, I think, for the panelists to actually answer questions live. And while they're doing that, maybe Rebecca had a question. She could ask hers first.
Hi, thanks, Tim. Amazing talk, Lilian. Thank you so much. I had a quick question about connectivity, and I'm wondering to what extent I'm sure you've got this question all the time, but to what extent your models of predictions of future distributions depend on connectivity, and whether that's something, if you think it's important, whether it's something that you are able to incorporate into your models at all.
Well, yes, it is definitely important to incorporate connectivity, and we do our best with the data that we have. Not every species has, for example, some information that you can imputate in a dispersal kernel model of to estimate, for example, the maximum dispersal capacity of a species. But I've recently developed some methods to compare the projected species distribution from the present into the future, and to create climate bridge models to connect those different layers, but technicalities apart, the thing is that yes, you need to incorporate connectivity, because as I said, not the very response of biodiversity to climate change will depend on whether they can or not move, but the exact way of incorporating that into your model will ultimately depend on, as is the case of any ecological modeling exercise, the data that you have in hands, the amount of information that you have for the species, and the response that you want to get. So if you want to trace, for example, a population genetic study, you will likely have a different approach that you would have if you had, for example, radio collars in megafauna species. So yes, you are absolutely right.
So it's a best case scenario then, the future distribution patterns. If the species can get there, then they might spread.
Well, yes. If you consider, because you can create scenarios of dispersal too. You can incorporate dispersal as a sensitivity analysis of your expected response. So in addition to the climate itself, you can incorporate land use, and you can incorporate dispersal, but you also can incorporate the effect of novel biotic interaction. So the models can become as complex as you want. But yes, you are absolutely right. The response of, if species are not allowed to move towards, for example, fragmented landscapes, their response will be much, much more pessimistic.
Great, thank you, Lilian. Carly had a question, I think, that is relevant. And many of these questions are now for both Lilian and Pedro, so both jump in as you see. Carly, are you unmuted?
I think so. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to ask more of a a management question, maybe a slightly controversial management question. And I would really like to hear both your opinions on, should we proactively manage biodiversity for a future climate? So for example, should we be planting trees in forests or in cities that will do well in a future climate, or do the risks of that kind of assisted migration outweigh the benefits?
You want to start, Lily?
Yes, I can. Carly, I think this question refers to the weight of uncertainties, how much confidence you have in your results, and how can you accurately anticipate the effects of climate change. So, for example, if you are doing this exercise in Canada, it's one thing. If you're doing it in Brazil, which is where I come from, it's completely different. I would say, as a rule of thumb, that in Brazil, I wouldn't do that, because the amount of data gaps that you have and the level of certainty that you have, or at least I wouldn't do that kind of management, of active management and translocation of species, because you have so many species and you have so many data gaps that it's almost impossible to anticipate all the potential consequences. But I would, even in Brazil, I would suggest some level of passive management. So for example, like the construction of habitat corridors that would eventually allow climate analogs to be connected from the present into the future. This kind of strategy, I would be more comfortable to suggest, for example, to the Brazilian government, build corridors, because the potential negative consequence seems to be less dangerous than translocating, 600s of species. But here in Canada, maybe there is a better data sampling and there is less species, so it's easier to monitor.
Yeah, so, well, Carly, you used the right term. It's very controversial, right? So, and I feel that there's a good difference between sometimes the way people think about terrestrial and they think about aquatic systems, for instance, particularly freshwater. So in trees, I know the US forest and here in Canada too, a lot of the thinking is to do small scale experiments that are controllable, that something bad happens, those trees. And so there is a lot of ongoing experiments on assisted migration going. But I tend to think that the view, unfortunately, is that even with, as Lilian was saying, that we create those potential corridors, it might not be fast enough. On the other hand, there's also the thinking that planting more trees, people are already thinking about these ideas, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, of planting more trees. Oh, it's good for climate change. Well, it can address some issues at global scales, but at the same time, so we're getting used. So people are already used with the thinking that we can plant trees regardless of whether they are native or not. Freshwater is a bit different. We've been experimenting with introduction of non-native species for a long time now. We can find rainbow trout in Quebec. We can find rainbow trout. This is native of California, right? And we can find it in Ontario. It's being introduced in some lakes. And the idea is that, lakes are smaller units, we can control better. And so there's, I think it's going to be system to system, but it's highly controversial. And I feel that answering a question like this, which is pretty loaded, we need actually consultation tables, right? We need people that understand the risks and that have done the lead work in terms of particularly experiments to understand the negative effects.
Great, thanks, Pedro. Brian Gallagher has an interesting question. I think he might be unmuted now.
I think I am. Can you hear me?
Yes, Brian.
Yeah, thank you both for the presentations. It was I learned a lot. So I work on climate change impacts at the population level in fish mostly, but I was really interested to see how you sort of presented it at the community level. and noted how modeling climate change impacts at the community level might require less mechanistic data than if you were focusing on, say, species or populations. So I was kind of curious if you think that focusing on the community level is like better in most situations or always better, or if there are certain species or situations where modeling below the community level would be preferable. And I guess just to note, like I've seen things in the literature where it can be hard to, like, for example, study like evolution at beyond like the population level, but like Lilian in her presentation showed that maybe isn't necessarily true. So yeah, I guess I would love to hear both of your opinions on that.
Want to start, Pedro?
Sure. That's another big question. I mean, even modelers have been discussing this forever. Should we model single species to compound into community predictions, or should we, sort of think about the entire community? One of the ways I often think is that, and we kind of starting to understand this more and more from a modeling point of view, is that combining information across many species can particularly represent variables that we haven't measured or mechanisms that we haven't measured that can actually help in modeling. We may not understand exactly why the model is doing better. Often this happens when we consider co-distributions, for instance, of species. There's modern ways to think about representing that variation as latent variables, which gets a little more technical. But then the next point is if compounding that. The other thing too is that often people are really interested in particular species for which we have far more information. Particularly, for instance, in the northern hemisphere, as Lilian was alluding, right, we have much fewer species, and we have much more knowledge about those species. So I think that may change. Technically, I will tell you, I've worked with these models for a long time. Technically, it depends. Sometimes you can get better predictions and make better scenarios using single species distributions. And sometimes you can use multiple species. It depends on all kinds of scenarios you want to present and how you want to represent those.
I would just compliment your response, Pedro, to say that climate change affects multiple dimensions of biodiversity at different scales, from genetic diversity to emerging properties of ecosystems. And as individual researchers, we all have our lens, right? Because we have a specific training, we did a specific path in our career, so we tend to approach problems using a specific approach, which is limited by what we know, right? That is why I feel like it's important that we as researchers and as advocates of climate change action, we not only try to resolve the things ourselves, but we talk to different people. So I don't think I have an answer for your question, a silver bullet answer to your question, but it's good that there are different minds focused on the same main target as to solve this problem of humanity, because each one of us will come with a different solution and will think on the idiosyncrasies of the study system that each one of us knows best. So we can find, if not only a global solution or a pragmatic solution that addresses all problems, at least we can find ways in the middle, I don't know if I answered your question, sorry.
Sounded like a pretty good answer to me, Lilian. Jochen Jaeger has a nice question for you, if he's unmuted.
Yes, thank you so much for your presentations. That was very helpful. I was wondering, you talked about all the things that can happen. Species can move, species can adapt. So I'm wondering, is this going to all level out in a nice way and there's no problem? But I have also heard some talk about an incipient anthropogenic mass extinction, and none of you even mentioned it. So does that mean you think there will not be a mass extinction anytime soon? What evidence is there that an anthropogenic mass extinction will not occur?
Lilian, I can start with this. by the way, I have to run exactly at 11. So, Johan, there's some studies coming out now. There's a few papers that were published just in the past 2 years, but one comes from a group, McGill, more recently by Briley Young and co-authors, showing, in fact, that a lot of, in general, the populations of single species, it's not all populations that are doing badly. In fact, they do a meta-analysis. Tends to be between 3 to 4% of the populations of those species that are not doing well, they're doing really badly. So they come up with a new statistics and new ways to actually show the evidence that, in fact, because we have to think about a species as a compound of many populations, right? And so there is strong evidence today, which is generating some other levels of discussion, that in fact is not the entire range of the species that is generally doing bad. It's a very few populations that brings down the numbers and the distributions so lower that we think actually it's worse than it is. So sometimes we need to take these things with grain of salt, as we know how people interpret, especially climate change deniers, that they interpret this kind of information. But I think there will start more and more evidence coming. Australians are showing that some of their populations are going much worse than in other places on the planet. So I think that would be a good evidence to support the idea that an Anthropogenic mass extinction may not happen, particularly if we take action early enough.
I wouldn't be conclusive as to any aspect of a mass extinction. First of all, because of the time frame in which mass extinctions have been measured in the past, in paleoecological time. You're talking about millions of years. You have rates of speciation and rates of extinction that are measured at a geological time scale. All we can do while living in the Anthropocene is to forecast and to anticipate the models. But as we mentioned several times, there is uncertainty in our models. And most often when you have these dynamic equilibrium systems, you only know the threshold once you've crossed it. So some deterministic models are difficult to predict because you need to go through a certain level of threshold and a level of impact before you see the outcome. So I wouldn't say anything about mass extinctions because we didn't approach this in specifically in the talk. But what we see is that the rates of extinction today are much higher than those from the paleoecological records. So, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be the apocalypse. Some species have always survived mass extinction events. But maybe this is something that we could develop properly in if we had more time to address those issues.
Great, thank you.
All right, Jim, unfortunately, I have to run. I have to take my daughter.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Pedro, for that. Maybe I'll let Lilian take one last question while you're departing, but thanks a lot, Pedro.
Thanks.
Lilian, here's a question for you. It's from Tristan in the chat. He said, if you had all the funding and power in the world, what would your plan look like to protect biodiversity, and how would your models help inform that decision? That's the toughest question.
That's the almost as if you were a demigod in conservation. What would you do? So if I had all the funding in the planet, oh my God, I don't know. If I had, let me just guess. If I had all the funding in the world, I would buy as much land as I could, because we could protect first and then manage later, only as a buffer zone, so we could have more ways to work on the things, because once everything is deforested, and at least in the tropical regions, that's where I come from, my thinking is guided through the biodiverse, mega diverse ecosystems. So if I were in Brazil And if I had all the funding that I could, I would buy as much land as I would, and I would set those as protected areas. And then I would manage them to maximize complementarity and to create connectivity among climate analogs. But this is a very, very tricky question because I don't have all the funding in the world. I cannot buy all the land that I want. I cannot buy a single house, to be honest. But what we want to do and what we need to do is to reshape our levels of consumerism. We need to reshape our individual actions, and we need to create this pressure, this societal pressure towards environmental and sustainability issues around the world.
That sounds like a fantastic answer. And you could use your models to help guide which land to buy.
Yes, I could. Thank you. Thank you.
Good. So act now with your science, and we'll do the best management we can on the fly with the time. That sounds like a fantastic answer, and maybe a great way to wind up this session. So thank you very much, Lilian, and to Pedro. I had to depart. That was a fantastic session. I'll turn it back over to Anna for a few last words.
Thanks, everybody. And thanks so much, Lilian and Pedro. He'll see this on the recording, the thank yous for your great presentations and all of you who piped in here today. I don't know if Rebecca wants to chime in and invite you to further sessions for today. Do you?
Sure, just quickly, we're back in 45 minutes. Is that right? 45 minutes with Satoshi Akita to talk about decarbonizing and carbon catching for planet positive futures. So that should be great. And that will be a discussion rather than a webinar. So it will be more interactive, although this has been great, very interactive as well in the webinar format. We also have at the end of the day today, a talk by a guest, Angela Carter, who will talk about the Keep Fossils, the Keep It in the Ground movement, about the policy implications of keeping fossil fuels in the ground. So that promises to be really interesting. Tomorrow morning, we have a whole series, a workshop, and then some presentations on life cycle assessment, which I think gets underrated, as life cycle assessment being ways in which we can measure the impacts of our actions, for example. So do come back for that. And then we have a careers panel on Friday for the students in the audience. We have 3 sustainability professionals who will be coming from different parts of the world, well, from different types of careers to answer your questions about careers. We have 4 events every day for the rest of the week, so do come back. And Anna, thank you for sharing the website in the chat. And I hope to see you all soon. Thanks for coming.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day. We'll see you in 45 minutes. Okay, we're closing up now. Thanks. Bye-bye.